They laughed when I walked into the room loud, careless, certain I had nothing left to defend, and as their voices piled on each other, tearing into me with the same old lies, something in my chest cracked the way it did years ago, the day my own sister looked me straight in the eye and said I wasn't worth standing beside. My name is Julia, and what happened at that rehearsal dinner was only the final blow in a betrayal that started long before anyone raised a glass. Charleston met me this moment I stepped out of the car, the air warm and salty, carrying memories I hadn't invited. Years had passed since I last stood here, yet a familiar heaviness tightened beneath my ribs. This city still echoed with the parts of my mother I wasn't ready to lose, and with the distance my family had quietly grown between us. The old brick streets hadn't changed, nor had the white steeples cutting into the sky or the porches draped in soft amber light. Charleston loved to present itself as gracious and timeless. I once found comfort in that. But over time, those same streets became reminders of how effortless it was for affection to fade, replaced by silence polite enough to be painful. I returned for Sophia, the sister who used to cling to my arm everywhere we went. Somewhere along the way, sweetness turned sharp. My father drifted into age and avoidance, while Martin filled the gaps with sermons about humility that somehow always pointed in my direction. No one asked where I had been. No one wondered what my life looked like now. They had already chosen the version of me that suited them. And it was easier to let them keep it than try to rewrite anything. The restaurant windows glowed ahead, spilling laughter across the parking lot. I paused, feeling more like a visitor than someone tied to these people by blood. Stepping inside felt less like coming home and more like stepping into a room that had already voted me out. Sophia appeared at the entrance and hugged me lightly. When she pulled back, her eyes swept over me, my shoes, hair, posture, quick assessments wrapped in a smile. Then she offered a casual remark, with a sting tucked neatly inside. And just like that, the night sparked to life. The moment I settled into my seat at the long dinner table, the imbalance in the room revealed itself with cruel clarity. Warmth clustered around Sophia, wrapping her in compliments and laughter as if she were the only reason anyone had gathered. Every remark directed at her carried admiration, a tone reserved for someone who could do no wrong. When attention drifted toward me, it arrived thin and brittle small, polite questions that skimmed the surface without ever touching anything real. I responded the way I always had, with a practiced nod, choosing silence over the exhaustion of trying to correct their assumptions. Then came the familiar sting of condescension disguised as curiosity. A relative leaned forward and asked if I was still working these days, as though the answer might surprise her, as though she had already imagined every version where I wasn't. I offered nothing more than a small smile, unwilling to grant her the satisfaction of discomfort. But the room shifted when my aunt started talking. She spoke loudly enough that half the table turned to listen, recounting a story about how, years ago, I had supposedly run into serious trouble in the service. She said it casually, like repeating something everyone already knew. Worse, she added that Sophia had stepped in to fix it, painting her as the responsible sibling who had saved me from myself. The sound of laughter rolled down the table, soft but cutting, and no one paused long enough to consider I might have been sitting close enough to hear. In that instant, the lie snapped into focus. Sophia hadn't just misunderstood something, she had carried that story, fed it, reshaped it until the whole family treated it as truth. It explained the quiet judgments, the sideways glances, the way they spoke to me as if I were someone who needed careful handling. A memory rose, unwelcome and sharp. Years ago in San Diego, I walked into my room to find Sophia rifling through my things. She had pulled open a drawer she had no reason to open and found a classified folder marked with a red seal. She couldn't possibly understand what it meant, but certainty bloomed across her face faster than I could stop her. She accused me of pretending to be more important than I was. When I tried to explain that she had no right to be in my things, she threw back a comment that lodged deep enough to stay. That moment lodged the first crack between us. Back at the table, I watched her laugh easily, unaware of the old bruise she kept pressing. The murmurs she had spread over the years weren't just exaggerations or misunderstandings. They were betrayal dressed as family concern, handed to relatives who repeated them until the story hardened into its own kind of truth. I lifted my glass, trying to ignore the slight tremor in my fingers. The wine wasn't to blame. It was the quiet realization, cold and sudden, that the distance between us had never been accidental. I had been trying to bridge a gap she kept widening behind my back. I stepped outside when the hum of conversation grew too sharp to ignore. The remarks inside weren't loud, but their edges were precise enough to leave a mark. I stood under the restaurant's awning, letting the night air steady me as I tried to push away the echo of voices that didn't know the damage they caused. A man in plain clothes approached, stopping several feet away as if he had been waiting for the moment I looked up. He didn't force conversation. He simply held his position, respectful, cautious. When our eyes met, he lowered his voice, keeping his words contained between us. "We're tracking someone who's attending this wedding event." The phrasing made something inside me shift. Not I. We. Only a few people used that term with intention, and none of them belonged to the world inside that restaurant. His tone was careful, measured, and when he continued, the truth settled quickly. "Ma'am, I know you can't talk here." Recognition clicked into place. He was one of ours. His posture, his tone, the distance he kept it all lined up with the training I knew too well. He didn't say his role, and I didn't need him to. His presence alone was enough. He explained briefly, telling me that Sophia had become entangled with a businessman under federal watch. Money laundering, marinas, quiet movements along Charleston's waterfront. Nothing immediate, he said, but enough to warrant concern. His words carried weight, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. That warning became the thread that pulled the entire night apart. It was the reason Captain Reeves would soon walk through the doorway, and the reason everything my family believed about me was about to split wide open. I walked back toward the noisy restaurant, the light spilling onto the pavement, as if nothing inside had shifted. But everything had. On one side stood a family eager to laugh at whatever version of me they preferred. On the other stood the reality of the life I carried alone, a world they had never once imagined I was part of. I stepped back in, silent but steady. The night had already changed, and none of them had the faintest idea how close the truth was to their table. When I stepped back into the dining room, the shift in the air was instant and unmistakable. Sophia had already begun telling some embellished version of the hardships I supposedly endured, her voice bright and theatrical enough to gather the table's full attention. Laughter rippled down the long stretch of linen, mingling with the sound of glasses meeting. Beneath it all hid the familiar undertone of judgment, drifting through the room like a draft no one bothered to block. Then she rose, lifting her glass as if proposing a toast to her own generosity. She thanked the guests for coming, glowing in their admiration, and casually slid a comment in my direction, something about me always trying my best in my own way. The table erupted in laughter. Heat crept up my neck, but I kept my breathing even, refusing to let her see the effect she hoped for. She pushed further, speaking about how not everyone was meant for military life, how some people only lasted until they were pushed out. The group fell into a tight, complicit silence, the kind that lets a lie settle quietly into the folds of a story no one questions. They believed her because she delivered it with confidence, not because it held any truth. Martin added his weight to the moment, patting Sophia's shoulder as he echoed the sentiment, praising her while dismissing me. His face carried that same paternal condescension he'd perfected over the years. Then her fiancé chimed in, leaning forward with a smirk, remarking that some people simply didn't have what it took. When our eyes met, I saw recognition flicker. He remembered exactly who I was and why his words were meant to land. He was savoring the chance to strike at me from the safety of a crowd that viewed him as family. I offered nothing in return. The absence of reaction unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Sophia stiffened, waiting for the explosion she could twist into proof of her narrative. But the quiet held, and the evening began to tilt under the weight of it. Then the businessman my subordinate had warned me about appeared beside Sophia, speaking in low tones about wedding arrangements. His smile faltered the moment his gaze crossed mine. Something sharpened in his expression, wariness, maybe even fear. He looked at me as though trying to place a memory he wished he didn't have. My pulse lifted, but I didn't let it show. The room was no longer just a family gathering. Lines were beginning to blur in ways no one else noticed. I listened to their laughter until it felt like the sound came from another world entirely. Betrayal crept in quietly, threading itself through the back of my ribs. These were the same people I had once believed deserved my silence, my distance, even my protection. And in return, they had reshaped me into a convenient story to fill their conversations. They didn't know the truth, but the truth was already on its way. I stepped outside before the weight of the room forced something out of me I couldn't take back. The back patio opened onto the faint hum of the harbor, the scent of salt brushing against my skin. I wasn't escaping. I was giving myself the space to remain steady. Voices drifted through the thin wall beside me, familiar enough that I didn't need to strain to hear. Sophia's tone sharpened as she complained about my appearance, insisting I had shown up looking like I had nowhere left to land. Her fiancé reassured her, confident I wouldn't cause trouble at the wedding. She laughed, reminding him that I had hardly survived military life. I closed my eyes, not from pain but to keep anger from bleeding into the choices I would need to make. Their words floated carelessly, unaware of how exposed they were. Then his voice trembled. He begged her not to let me speak to his friends from the reserve unit, afraid they might learn about his failed application. The fear in his voice snapped into place like a puzzle piece I had been waiting for. It confirmed everything he had been hiding behind his smug comments. When I walked back through the door, one of the young men from his unit glanced at me and instinctively straightened. He recognized me. His reaction wasn't fear, it was respect he didn't know how to mask. Sophia misread it instantly. Assuming he was intimidated, she couldn't have been more wrong. The businessman approached next, asking if we had crossed paths before. His voice sounded too tight, too careful. He withdrew quickly when I didn't answer. My phone vibrated, a coded message pulsing quietly on the screen. "Ma'am, I'm approaching the restaurant. Need to confirm subject presence." Captain Reeves was close. I looked back into the dining room, watching Sophia glow under the lights, oblivious to the storm forming just beyond her reach. She believed she had secured her narrative. She had no idea it was about to shatter. I stepped out onto the terrace again, where the doorway glowed like a stage waiting for its lead actor. I hadn't chosen this moment, but it had arrived anyway. And once the truth walked in, none of them would ever view me the same again. I had only just returned to the banquet hall when the main doors opened again, and a group of reservists walked in, their uniforms shifting the atmosphere like a sudden draft. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Laughter thinned into uneasy silence. Sophia nudged her fiancé with a triumphant grin, convinced their presence would somehow keep me in line. One young reservist spotted me. Recognition flickered across his face, chin lifting, shoulders tightening in reflex. Sophia misread the moment, whispering that he looked terrified of me. But his reaction wasn't fear. It was discipline. A subtle shake of my head kept him from doing anything that would reveal more than he intended. Her fiancé hurried toward the group, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. He glanced at me once, then looked away sharply, praying they wouldn't expose the part of his past he'd worked so hard to bury. Guests began to whisper, speculating about inspections and mistakes, while Sophia lifted her glass and joked that maybe they had come to escort me out. The laughter was thinner now, forced around the edges. Then Charles Ward rose from his seat and made a clumsy attempt for the side exit, only to have one of the reservists step into the doorway, unintentionally blocking him. He froze, sweat gathering at his collar. Sophia noticed only the awkwardness, assuming he'd had too much to drink. She didn't understand he was being watched. My phone buzzed with a coded triple vibration. "Ma'am, Captain Reeves is 2 minutes out." My breath steadied. Everything was aligning. I lifted my head toward the entrance. My family kept laughing, unaware that the moment they'd built their mockery around was about to collapse in on itself. The door shimmered under the chandelier's glow, waiting for the truth to walk through. The doors opened again, and the room fell completely still. Captain Reeves stepped inside in Navy tactical uniform, rank glinting under the warm lights. His gaze swept across the hall with unmistakable intent. Sophia's smile bloomed wide, convinced he'd come to confirm whatever story she'd spun. She rushed toward him, welcoming him like a VIP and loudly implying he needed to deal with me. Laughter flickered across the room again, brief, uncertain. Captain Reeves didn't look at her. Not once. His eyes fixed straight on me. He stopped only a few steps away. Sophia positioned herself between us, pointing toward me as if offering him a problem to solve. He countered her by stepping back half a pace, shifting his line of sight so that she ceased to exist entirely. A nearby reservist stiffened, instantly recognizing the hierarchy unfolding. Sophia opened her mouth again, but her voice died the moment Captain Reeves raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. "Admiral Ramirez, ma'am! The team is ready!" Silence hit the room like a shockwave. A glass shattered somewhere behind us. Her fiancé stumbled back, gripping a chair for balance. Sophia turned toward me, pale and speechless. The truth stood beside me now, unmistakable. Captain Reeves waited, then spoke again. "Ma'am, we'll escort you when you're ready." I set my napkin down, calm and steady. Nothing more needed to be said. The room stayed locked in silence long after Captain Reeves raised his salute. I remained by the table, still as stone, while Sophia stood between us with her face drained of every trace of certainty she once carried. It felt as though someone had pulled the oxygen from the room, leaving nothing but stunned breaths and pounding hearts. The captain held his salute a beat longer than protocol demanded, and I understood it wasn't ceremony. It was recognition. My family stared at me like strangers. My father clutched the arms of his chair, searching for an explanation he had avoided for years. Martin's throat bobbed as he struggled to swallow his own disbelief. Sophia's fiancé slumped into his seat, the weight of every smug word he'd spoken collapsing onto him. Sophia tried to speak, pointing at me, then at the captain, then back at me again, her voice cracking as she tried to force a different truth into existence. Captain Reeves lowered his hand and calmly told her to step aside. The words struck her harder than any argument ever could. I nodded once, quiet. Steady. No speeches. No vindication. The truth stood on its own. A young reservist snapped to attention beside the captain, instinct overriding every social pretense in the room. Sophia watched him, watched me, and finally saw what she had spent years denying. I stepped away from the table, heading toward the one person in that room who had always known exactly who I was. As I stepped forward, Captain Reeves addressed the room with the steady clarity only years of command could shape. He explained that they were here to confirm the presence of Charles Ward, and that I had overseen the case for months. One sentence simple, direct, and the entire hall trembled under the weight of it. Conversations died instantly. Chairs creaked as people shifted, trying to understand how the evening had turned so sharply. Ward tried to rise, but the young reservist blocked his path with quiet authority. Sophia looked from Ward to me, then back to Captain Reeves, her expression unraveling as the pieces finally snapped into place. The man funding her wedding was under federal investigation. I had been supervising that very case. I had stayed silent because my work demanded it, and she had mocked the person who had been protecting her without ever knowing it. The realization washed the last trace of arrogance from her face. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. A part of me wanted to reassure him, to soften the blow. But another part understood that people must live with what they choose to believe. I didn't offer explanations or justifications. I didn't list my rank or recount my years of service. I simply told Sophia that my silence had never come from weakness. It had come from duty. The words struck deeper than anything raised voices could have accomplished. Captain Reeves spoke again, telling the room that many standing there owed their safety to my work. Sophia broke into tears, while her fiancé kept his gaze fixed on the floor. I took the document the captain handed me and signed it with practiced efficiency. It wasn't a display. It was procedure. Completing the moment was all that mattered. Then I looked at Sophia once more, calm, steady, and without resentment. There was no triumph in the truth. There was only clarity. I left the banquet hall before anyone could find their voice. Captain Reeves and 2 young officers cleared a quiet path for me, and when the door shut behind us, the muffled sobs and frantic whispers inside only sharpened in contrast. I didn't turn back. By morning, Sophia's messages filled my screen, pleas for a conversation, apologies tangled in confusion, requests for me to stay. I read every word, then powered the phone off. Some things no longer needed answering. At my father's house, I left a single letter on the kitchen counter. 4 lines, nothing more. I told her I hadn't stayed silent out of fear, that she had hurt me because she believed I never would speak. Silence wasn't weakness, and respect was never hers to demand. A military vehicle carried me out of Charleston toward the docks where my ship waited. Captain Reeves held the door, offering a quiet nod. The sea breeze met me with its familiar sting, cold, sharp, honest. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened. I hadn't returned to teach anyone a lesson. Life had done that for me. I only returned to the place that had always been mine, the ocean, the discipline, and the calm of someone who no longer needs to prove a thing.